Inflation. Governments fear it, consumers hate it, and the media lies about it. My name is James Lee, and today we will uncover together the web of lies and propaganda spun by the mainstream media to obfuscate the truth about inflation.
It's not just one factor, but several that's fueling inflation.
The reason for inflation?
Do you see this flaring up inflation?
That's the main cause of inflation.
An inflation conspiracy theory is infecting the Democrat Party.
The inflation propaganda has come full circle, and today we are going to go on a 3-year journey to expose the insane lies we've been told about the causes and effects of inflation. Let's go back to early 2020. Shortly after the pandemic took hold of the world, on March 27, 2020, Congress passed a $2 trillion plus stimulus package called the CARES Act. Part of the package included direct aid to individuals and households in the form of a $1,200 stimulus check to provide relief for those whose jobs were impacted by pandemic shutdowns. In December of that year, Congress passed yet another stimulus bill, the Coronavirus Response and Relief Act, which doled out another $600 check to individuals making under $75,000 a year. In March of 2021, Congress passed the final coronavirus stimulus bill, the American Rescue Plan Act, which distributed another $1,400 to most Americans. $3,200 in total to the people, and some at the very top were not too happy. Economist Larry Summers, Bill Clinton's Treasury Secretary and Barack Obama's top economic advisor, was a high-profile critic of these relief checks.
I don't think the $2,000 checks make much sense. I'm not even sure that I'm so enthusiastic about the $600 checks. And I think taking them to $2,000 would actually be a pretty serious mistake that would risk a temporary overheat.
In a Washington Post op-ed published in February of 2021, a month after the final relief check was issued to Americans, Summers wrote that the stimulus checks would, quote, set off inflationary pressures of a kind that we have not seen in a generation. And when inflation jumped from 1.7% in February of 2021 to 7.9% a year later, cable news and its army of pundits and experts quickly placed the blame on these stimulus checks.
The reason for inflation? The stimulus.
We have placed ourselves at risk for this inflation that we're now seeing.
$1,400 direct payments could be deposited into bank accounts as early as this weekend. Do you see this flaring up inflation the way we are seeing some market participants viewing this?
Absolutely, Maria.
He just passes this really, really massive stimulus, and I think that that's the main cause of inflation.
So their assertion is that the economy freaked out because people made a couple $1,000s more. Is there any truth to that? Andrew Yang, who ran for president in 2020 with UBI, Universal Basic Income, as a core tenet of his platform, he had this to say.
The relief checks and the enhanced child tax credit, it gets mistakenly blamed for inflation later, which is very upsetting and frustrating and troubling.
Yeah.
Because everyone's like, oh, you send checks out and then prices go up. It's like, well, if you do the math, you realize that the checks were a very, very small component of the $5 trillion that went out. I try and explain to people, it's like, look, $5 trillion is 15, 16,000 a head. Like, do you remember sending out 15, 16,000 a head? You sent out maybe like $1 or $2 grand a head. So what the hell happened to the other, 13, 14 grand?
Yeah, what did happen to the rest of the money? Taking a closer look at the CARES Act, the first of the 3 coronavirus stimulus bills, only about a quarter of the money went to helping individuals and households. $290 billion went to direct payments, that's the $1,200 check. Another $260 billion for additional supplemental unemployment. Much of the rest, the $1.2, $1.4 trillion was handed out to some of the wealthiest in this country, corporations, businesses, and major industries like the airlines as tax breaks, loans, and grants. So while it is certainly the case that the Fed, quote unquote, printed a lot of money in the year following the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, which could and did contribute to inflation just based on fundamental supply and demand principles, the reality is that almost none of that money went to regular people. So the mainstream narrative continued to evolve in the coming months.
The global supply chain crisis hasn't been seen since World War II.
Cargo ships continue to sit in an ocean parking lot off the coast of California as millions of goods are in limbo.
It's an LA traffic jam in the Pacific.
In October of 2021, the Wall Street Journal tied inflation to supply chain disruptions occurring as a result of the pandemic aftershock. Which isn't inaccurate because the pandemic did throw the entire global supply chain in complete disarray, causing supply shortages and a subsequent price increase. But to what degree? That is the question. And it was around this time where rumblings in independent media along with other academics began to surface about the true impact of the supply chain crisis on prices and what else might actually be the real driver of inflation. To cite one specific example, on December 29, 2021, friend of the show Matt Stoller posited on his Substack newsletter, Big, that corporate profits drove 60% of inflation increases. Based on his analysis, after backing out planned inflation, which is roughly 2% historically, 60% of the increase in inflation went directly to corporate profits, while the other 40% could be explained by the Fed's monetary policy and the global supply chain crisis. Provocative, or at least it was at the time, and legacy media totally freaked out. Just a few weeks later, on January 10th, 2022, the Washington Post editorial board published an op-ed asserting that pinning the current inflation problems on corporate greed is a quote-unquote flimsy argument. Other op-eds followed, claiming greedflation, as it later became commonly known, to be fake, a witch hunt, some even going as far as calling it a conspiracy theory.
Inflation conspiracy theory is infecting the Democrat Party, and she goes after what she's coining as greedflation. And she's basically saying, look, the idea of blaming all of these companies for raising their prices when all of the prices of everything that goes into what they make has gone up, and they're trying to just keep their heads above water in a lot of cases. Some of them are doing quite well.
But hang on a second. Some are doing quite well. Was that a Freudian slip there? In September of 2022, The Intercept reported that CEOs of major corporations have been praying for inflation because it's an excuse to jack up prices. And this was all caught on tape.
We view a little bit of inflation as always good in our business. We would expect to be able to pass that through.
And as I've said before, inflation has been a little bit of our friend in terms of what we see at retail pricing.
We want to make sure that we're not leaving any pricing on the table. We'll take as much pricing as the consumer can absorb.
And we know if we need to take more pricing, we have room to do it. To date, we've seen no resistance from our customers.
I'm really pleased our sales teams have gotten much better at pricing than ever in the history of the company. We're not going to be giving this pricing back. Now it's not a matter of can we take a price increase? Now it's about how much of a price increase are you going to take?
Inflation is good for business. Inflation is our friend. We will raise prices as much as we can, and we aren't going to give it back. Sounds a lot like corporate manufactured inflation that has nothing to do with global supply chain disruptions or monetary policy. You tell me what you think. I mean, it's not exactly a secret that in the past couple years, despite constant talks of a recession, is it already here? Is it 6 months away? Corporate profits have been at an all-time high. And according to data released by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the past 3 years, from 2020 to 2022, saw a dramatic increase in the contribution of corporate profits as a percentage of unit price, while other costs, such as employee compensation, have decreased. In March of this year, the Economic Policy Institute estimated that between 2020 and 2022, corporate profits have contributed to more than a third of price growth. So how does mainstream media square this circle? How do they continue to do the bidding of their corporate masters while also facing facts that corporations are greedy by nature? I will tell you. Just a few weeks ago, on May 25th, 2023, the Wall Street Journal published this article. Greedflation is real and probably good for the economy. Okay, so this brings us full circle. As friend of the show and Intercept reporter Ken Klippenstein aptly pointed out, that over the course of a couple years, the idea that corporate profits contribute to inflation went from a conspiracy theory to real and probably a good thing. The journal claims that, quote, a bit of corporate greed, which they admit is contributing significantly to inflation, is actually a good thing because it may be helping the fight against recession. A bit of mental gymnastics, they got themselves tied up in a little bit of a knot. Hard to say, but to lay out the message clearly, what they are saying is that inflation from corporate price increases, which so happens to put money in the hands of shareholders, that's actually a good kind of inflation. But in another one of their recent articles, they say that inflation from wage growth, where money is put in the hands of a regular worker, that's a bad kind of inflation that we really need to be worried about. I hope you see the game, the farcical nature of mainstream media coverage. It is all propaganda facilitated by the entire legacy media ecosystem on behalf of their corporate and billionaire owners who will undoubtedly benefit from such massive increases in corporate profits, all with the goal of maintaining their power and control over you. But we have a choice. We can choose to believe in this type of propaganda, or we can refuse such narratives that blame regular people, narratives that are meant to divide the working class, narratives that are designed to indoctrinate you into defending your oppressors. Only then can we potentially change the status quo. Thank you so much for watching. What do you think? Sound off in the comments below. If you enjoy these Beyond the Headlines segments, I would encourage you to check out and subscribe to my YouTube channel, 5149 with James Lee. The link will be in the description below. I'd really appreciate that. And as always, keep on tuning into Breaking Points, and thank you so much for your time today.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.